Hello, everyone. I am Melanie Mendez Gonzales. I am the founder and creator of the award-winning blog called ¿Qué Means What?, where I explore Latinidad through entertainment, leadership, and cultural life right here in San Antonio. And it is an honor for me to be sitting on stage with these amazing journalists and people in media. I have to really quickly say, follow up from David's talk. I've been doing I've been a blogger before there was a word influencer. And one of the first things that I did that I was so super proud of was be selected by the National Park Foundation to go on a trip with 7 other Latino influencers. And we went to Grand Teton National Park, and I got to meet David and Melissa. And I remember asking, okay, well, where's the Latino history, right? Because that's what we were supposed to be learning. And it was David. It was David. And I'm just so proud of that experience. So I had to acknowledge you both from the stage. Thank you very much. But this conversation is about Latinos in media. So we're going to get started with, first I want to say welcome from Austin, the both of you, yes. And Silvia, I know you go back and forth between here and Washington, but I want to say congratulations on your Pulitzer Prize. A round of applause for Silvia and her team. Silvia Foster Frau is from the Washington Post, an investigative reporter. Lucy Flores is owner-creator of the amazing Luz Media, which is all Latina-led and run. And Luis Patiño, welcome back to San Antonio. He is currently serving as the CEO of Austin PBS, but you might know him from his roles here in San Antonio with Univision. Welcome, everyone. And I want to, since this topic is the representation of Latinos in news media in particular, I'd like to go down the row and you share a little bit more about your accomplishments and your work, but also answer the question that I have for all of you is, how do you assess the current state of Latino representation in mainstream media, and what changes have you observed over this last decade?
Would you like for me to go first? Well, first of all, thank you. As you mentioned, I do feel like I'm back home. See a lot of my San Antonio friends from my time here serving as the president and general manager for KWEX, which is a proud moment in my career. As you think about, sort of the history of especially Spanish language media, I'm constantly having to educate people throughout the country that it all started here in San Antonio back in 1955 with Mr. Nicolás, before him, his father-in-law, Mr. Cortés, Raúl Cortés. And really, I think this is the perfect place to have this conversation. It's where Spanish radio started, Spanish TV, and a lot of people don't remember, but La Prensa was La Prensa before it was La Opinión in LA, right? La Familia Lozano. And then you can just go down the line. Everything from what was then the Mexican-American Chamber of Commerce, soon to be the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, LULAC, MALDEF, go right down the line. So San Antonio has a real deep and rich history for me. And then I got blessed to run the station in Los Angeles, KMEX. And there got to learn about historical figures like Rubén Salazar, which many of you may have heard of, one of the premier Spanish language and really English language journalists before he actually went on to be the news director for KMEX. A lot of people know his history as a reporter, international correspondent for the LA Times, who later on was tragically, some people would say killed, some people would say murdered. It kind of depends on what you read or who you want to listen to. But the story of Rubén Salazar, I think, is one of a beautiful part of our rich history of storytelling, of somebody who went out into the community and really investigated the types of stories that wouldn't otherwise get told had it not been for him telling those stories. And I think that's a part of our history in many, many ways. You think back to a good friend now of mine who I got to meet throughout my 25-year career at Univision, Jorge Ramos, also started as a beat reporter in Los Angeles at KMEX, well before he went on to national fame in Miami. And again, if you talk to people like him and others, they were out there telling the stories that would otherwise go untold. And as it relates to Spanish language media, you know, you really think about an organization that was born out of mission, born out of purpose, right? Born to give a voice to the voiceless. I mean, that was a big part of the conversation that I would always hear here in San Antonio, which was, you know, without KWX, people would not know where their local voting location was, know about new city rules and regulations, the real basic, what we used to call in the news business, sort of news you can use, right? The real basics. And I can't help but see one of our pioneers here in the room too, who started at KWEX many, many years ago, and she is still doing her thing. Martita, ¿cómo estás? Yes, yes. One of the true pioneers. So you know, I've been blessed with having been a part of such memorable and historic figures, institutions, and now, you know, when I hear talks about LBJ, it makes me really proud to be part of the public media and PBS and our brothers and sisters at NPR who do such great work. 1967 was the signing of the Public Media Act by LBJ himself, one of the things that he doesn't always get a lot of credit for, and he should. He did a phenomenal job in really creating the institution that then became the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which then you know, really helped to support and to launch what is now PBS and NPR. And I'm a very, very proud member of that family now. And just happy to be here. Thanks. I know that was a long introduction. Sorry.
You also didn't answer the question.
Which is what?
The changes you've seen in the media landscape.
Well. I mean, I think what's old is new, right? What's old is new. And I would say that we started off telling the stories that were untold, and now here we are in a time when it is very difficult to tell those stories once again. Those stories are getting shut down. I can tell you that, you know, it's now being on the public media space, we still have a long ways to go to make sure that we have journalists at all the right tables. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Sunday news programs. There's not enough of us that look like us on those news programs. So in many ways, I think that we've advanced a lot from where we were in 1955. But in some ways, I think we've gone backwards.
That was my former chair of my committees coming out, so.
I know.
So my background is, thank you for that. My background is not in media or journalism, but it is in comms and communications. And what I mean by that is that my background is in politics. I was the first Latina ever elected to the state legislature in the history of Nevada. Thank you. That was actually fairly recently. That was in 2010, and I say that because that's the problem, right? That you have a state that had still, I mean, obviously more now, but at that time, a very large Latino population, and had been in the union for, 100 years, and had never had a Latino ever in the state legislature, right? So yes, it was a really great accomplishment, but the fact that it only recently happened is something that needs to be acknowledged and pointed out. So fast forward, and how I got into media is that we have, to what Luis just pointed out, we have had this significant underrepresentation problem across all facets of American life, but certainly in media forever, right? And it's still a problem. It's a significant problem. And so I'll say, as a warning, I might sound a little pessimistic, but it's not pessimism. It's realism about where we're at and what we need to continue doing, and the aggressiveness with how we need to continue doing that, right? So I was in a very high-profile primary with another Democrat, lost that primary, and I said, I'm done. I left all of my being and my soul on this field, and I am done with politics. I mean, obviously, you're never really done with politics. But I decided, I gave like the best years of my life to my community and to this service. So I think I'm going to take a little break. And didn't know what that was. Ended up in digital media by just a course of events. And it made a lot of sense for me because I had spent essentially the last decade of my life trying to communicate with my community very sometimes hard to understand concepts, complicated concepts about policy, et cetera, and kind of being the interpreter, if you will, to the community at large to try to get them to not only understand what we were doing, but also to, of course, get them engaged and to understand that they had real power if they realized what was actually happening, right? And who was making those decisions on their behalves. So when I was asked to lead the public affairs practice for a digital media outlet called mitú, which is a digital media publication that focuses on millennials and Gen Zers, Latino, English dominant, all digital, I thought to myself, I had like a moment of imposter syndrome where I was like, I don't know anything about media, you know? And then I thought to myself, but what is media? Media is talking. Media is communicating. Media is getting information out to the public. And I'm really good at that. So yeah, I'll do this. And yeah, it actually was a pretty long learning curve, but it wasn't long before I started to realize the machinations and the structure of media and how that very much was influencing and very much affecting our even internal beliefs about ourselves and what Latinos were capable of and what we've accomplished in the past and how that is systematically being excluded from the media landscape as a whole, whether it's news, whether it's entertainment, whether it's now social and digital. And that was such a massive, it was almost like, it was my calling where I realized, wow, this is where the power is at, right? Information and reach is where the power is at. The person who controls the narrative controls the outcome, right? Controls what you think, controls what you believe about yourself. And so when there was a restructure of mitú, I decided that I was going to launch my own media company. Easier said than done. It has been very much a labor of love in some cases, but I've really stuck with it because of that recognition of how powerful media is and how underrepresented we are in it and the harmful effects of what that does to us. So the changes that I've noticed in the last, I've been doing this now for almost 5 years. Luz Media is just under 5 years old. And then my prior time with mitú is that, first off, we're obviously so underrepresented that there's news media and media deserts all over the country, right? There's 66 million Latinos in the US, and yet the media landscape as a whole, as far as Latino-owned media, is, if you can imagine, a pie chart or a Venn diagram, right? Like the entire thing is here. Our media landscape is this tiny little dot, right? That's the enormity of the underrepresentation and the inability to reach Latinos by Latino-owned media. And that has, and I'm sure we'll talk about journalists and Latino journalists, and obviously one of our stars right here. But if we have a bunch of Latino journalists, and we have places like the LA Times, and corporate-owned media, which is now a significant problem, right? Where you have the LA Times, who has a majority Latino audience in LA, and yet they gutted their very first Latino vertical in the LA Times, right? So when they cut hundreds of, or I don't know if it was hundreds, but I think it's like 120 or something, reporter positions, got rid of almost all, except for like 1 or 2 of their Latino reporters. So if we have Latino reporters, but they have nowhere to go, then we still have a significant problem, right? So it's not just about the reporters in the pipeline, it's also about the media landscape and who owns that media. And so that's been the biggest changes that I think that I've seen, is that you now are really seeing the rise of a concerted effort to not only have a pipeline of talented and qualified storytellers, but also a place for them to go. And so that's what I'm trying to do with Luz Media.
Yeah, so I think I was in college when I realized that I wanted to get into journalism, and it was the first time I had heard that phrase, giving voice to the voiceless, and I really wanted to cover the Latino community and social services, and I was applying kind of all over the country, and the first and only job that I got was in Greenwich, Connecticut, which if any of you know what that place is, it's one of the wealthiest areas in the country and probably one of the whitest too. So I lasted there for about a year, and then at that point came to the San Antonio Express News. And then from there spent about 5 years here covering immigration. It was really like a dream job of mine. And it's funny because though throughout my career, I think awareness of the problem of needing more Latinos in news has increased, like in my colleagues and even in myself, like realizing that this was some of the personal things that I struggled with or thought about were like actually like a systemic phenomenon, like kind of the understanding that that was bigger than just me. I feel like that has grown and gotten better in my career, but weirdly, as I have like ascended kind of the journalism hierarchy, the reverse has happened in terms of actual representation in the newsrooms I've been in. I remember here at the Express News, I think we were at like 40% Latinos in the newsroom, and our diversity committee was really like kind of upset about that and really committed to increasing that to like the 65% that's representative of our community. And then in 2021, I moved to the Washington Post in Washington, D.C., and there it's the Latino representation is only at 5% in the newsroom. The New York Times is now at 7%. And the Post has been around 5 or 6% Latino for years. And so in that sense, I went from this place where there were still a number of Latinos in the newsroom to having a total mind shift and realizing that some of the biggest and most powerful media institutions in this country are still very behind where they need to be. And we're a very small but mighty group there. We have we have an internal Slack channel called Cafecito, and we share each other's stories, and we try to uplift them whenever we can, and like really have formed a tight support network. But you see there the progress that needs to be made, and we've tried to push for more article translations. We've tried to push for changes in the types of stories we're telling. I thought about a lot when I've been listening to the earlier panels today, like a lot of the conversation has been about, how we tell history and who is included in history. And as journalists, we always say we're writing the first draft of history. We're publishing the stories that are kind of the defining narratives of what's happening at this year and this time between these people or these groups. And so we're really determining then when we look back on history how that is told too. And that's happening in real time, which also means that we should feel very empowered to try to change that now and like kind of set the record straight on that.
Thank you, Silvia. Thank you, Silvia. I think I want to stick with you, and I want to read a little bit of data from the National Association of Hispanic Journalists in their report about newsrooms. 20 out of 22 newsrooms conducted from 21 to 23, it revealed that 60% of investigative news reporters are white, 13% are Latino, 9% are Black, and less than 1% are indigenous. And the diversity is even less amongst editors. So as an investigative reporter, you have highlighted how government politics affect diverse populations, how important is investigative journalism in uncovering and addressing issues related to Latino representation and civil rights? And follow up, can you share any notable experiences or stories where your work had a significant impact on the community?
I think investigative journalism is really important in general because it allows us to take the time and resources to hold big forces accountable, and you can really dig in and tell a very nuanced story. And a lot of times, especially in this day and age when local reporting and newsrooms in general are like so squeezed for resources and time, it feels very special to be at a place that even has positions like that. And they're harder and harder to come by, but they can often be looking at things through that angle of like accountability can really help unveil some of the the real inequalities and cover-ups that are going on like across the country. And so I think for the Latino community especially, you know, that kind of intentionality with trying to find out those inequalities can be really beneficial. But I think there's very few positions like those left in the country, and of those, the investigative reporting realm is a very white realm in particular. So like we all have different beats, right? Some folks cover education, immigration, investigation and politics tend to be very hard to find diversity there. So in my role as an investigative reporter, I go out in the country and kind of find different stories that need to be told, and I try to, as much as possible, focus on communities of color and the way that our governments and institutions are disservicing them. And one of the recent stories I did was in Sunland Park, New Mexico, where I had been going through data online and found that this water utility had been issued a number of violations by the EPA for its drinking water standards. And it had been for like the last 4 years. That was only the data that was available. And so I started like doing more research and poking around. It's a 95% Latino community in New Mexico, near the border with Mexico, and did records requests and basically came to uncover that for at least 16 years, if not more, the arsenic levels had been illegally high in the drinking water of this community. And people reported to me all sorts of health problems, from cancer to diabetes, so many like early deaths, and families that, especially with cancer, that had just been like eviscerated by cancer. And they were really struggling to get the government to listen to them and to be heard. And they were a community that even in the 1980s and 90s had formed groups and protests over a landfill that had had a dump over their water. And so they had this like really long legacy and history of having to constantly fight to get these basic government services in place. You know, like water is like pretty much as fundamental as you can get. It's like a basic human need. And the fact that in 2024, these folks were drinking arsenic water, and for over a decade, whole families coming up and growing up drinking that water, is pretty astounding. And so I went in there, I talked to as many people as I could, I requested all this data, and I put it together. And during the course of that process, the state of New Mexico, who I was like requesting comment from, asking for more records from, trying to figure out like how this went on for so long when it was even being like federally reported and reported to the state too. Over the course of that time period, they began launching their own investigations and probes into the water utility. And so that was a really great action that was starting to be taken. I don't think that community's problems has been solved, and I think there were actually, one of the things that often happens is when you go there, you find like 20 other stories of things that are going wrong. And so I think there's also like way more that needs to be addressed for that community. But that's just an example, I guess, of why it's important to have reporters who are looking at these angles and at these communities in this way.
I agree. Thank you, Silvia, for that. And Luis, I want to bring it to you because you have this big background of building these civic engagement projects and initiatives focused on education and entrepreneurship. So I'm curious as how you think media organizations like Austin PBS could use those initiatives to enhance representation of Latinos in the media.
Sure. I'll go back before even Austin PBS. But just in general, I think, when you're part of a media institution like Univision that's, again, all about mission and community and really always has been, it's pretty much all we did, right? Was all these initiatives that would go out and reach out to the community. One of the biggest ones was probably around civic engagement and our constant and consistent push to get people not just to vote, because before they can vote, they have to register, right? So there was this continuous, and you can see it now if you watch Spanish language media, to really educate our community about the importance of being part of our real civic duty to get out and to participate and to register to vote and to go out and vote. And I think that consistency and the numerous initiatives and campaigns that we would have on a national level, but then also locally, whether it was San Antonio, Austin, LA, I think those have really proven to have increased the numbers, which can always get better. They need to get better for sure. But I would say civic engagement was one of them. Probably the most recent one, which was one that we had always done financial education, but we had never really taken a deep dive into entrepreneurship. And when you look at all the numbers, and we did some investigating and partnered with the Stanford Latino Initiative for Entrepreneurs and saw that the numbers, especially of Latina-owned businesses, were on the rise substantially. And they really weren't getting the type of coverage that the general market media or the English language media was giving it. So we launched a campaign at Univision in LA that we called Posible. Everything is posible. Todo es posible. And the whole premise of that was to really say, for those Hispanic-owned businesses that maybe they don't know how to scale, they don't know how to access capital, they don't know how to write a business plan, they don't know that the SBA has free services like the SBDC that can provide all these different tools for them in language, in their own language or in English, however they choose. So really what we did is we went hard on really focusing on educating and informing entrepreneurs. And it just so happened that was right around the time that all of a sudden we had the pandemic. And that is really when our Hispanic businesses were suffering, because many of them did not have relationships with financial institutions. And if you did not have a relationship with a financial institution, guess what? It was going to be really, really hard for you to take advantage of the loans and the government programs, the PPP loans specifically, and the government programs, which is why our Hispanic entrepreneurs and small business owners really suffered more so than some of their counterparts who had those relationships. So I would say that was one area that was kind of unique to us because nobody else was really doing it at the time. And as a media company, sometimes you're not the subject matter expert. That's not your role, right? We were not experts in entrepreneurship per se. What we were experts is in getting the word out, in scaling and being sort of that amplifier, right? So we did that. We went from LA to about 4 or 5 markets in California and turned it into a national entrepreneurship campaign that Univision to this day continues to embark on. So I think that the media does have a role to play in a lot of these community engagement efforts because, as you were saying, you know, we have that huge responsibility, but we also have the power to scale messaging. I mean, if you think about all the wonderful nonprofits that exist here in San Antonio or up in Austin, they do amazing work. What's their number one problem? Is letting people know about it, right? Is their inability to have a marketing campaign or a media campaign and to let other people know about it. So I think that the media plays a huge role in partnering with all of these organizations that do such great work, but just cannot afford or don't have the know-how on how to get the word out.
I want to stay on that just a little bit because it makes me think about why it's important to have the talent pipeline so that we have Latina reporters who want to share these stories. But what we do know today is that a majority of Latinos are getting their news and information online, and particularly through social media. So I want to bring it to Lucy to talk about Luz Media. And you, we said it already, but you're Latina-owned, you're Latina run. What responsibility do you have in keeping it that way and sharing those stories? And what impact do you think it's making on the community that is following you? Which I'm one, by the way.
Oh, yay, thank you. Gosh, it's such a hard question, I feel. Because, you know, as I listen to kind of both aspects, right? Like we've heard about the accountability piece and how critical that is, right? Investigative reporting and the need for Latino reporters and journalists. And then you kind of hear the other aspect of the community-based need, right, and that responsibility and that purpose in getting the word out, right? Just like the basic reach, which is what media does, right? I always say, like, when we talk about how small the Latino media infrastructure is and this necessity, and how it's like so important to remind people that it is about reach, it's about scale. I always basically say, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? That's the basic premise. Like, there's critical investigative work being done. But if no one knows the story, if no one hears it, then how is there going to be any accountability, right? If there's important initiatives going on in the community and important work that's being done and information that needs to be told and heard by people, but no one is amplifying it, then how are people actually going to be served, right? So I feel like, for me, Luz Media really is in the middle of that. We are attempting to scale the Latino media infrastructure in a way where we can be a place for accountability, and we can be a place to actually get news that's useful, information that's useful to the community, while also recognizing that as Latina entrepreneurs, we don't have the resources that we need, right? I actually did raise capital to launch Luz Media, and venture capital goes to 0.2% of all women. Less than 1%, less than 0.5%, right? Like, think about that. That is no longer lack of effort, right? That is systemic. That is systemic discrimination and internal bias, conscious bias, unconscious bias, all the things, right? All the biases, yes. And I was able to raise despite that, right? But, I guess going back to the question is that is why it's so critical to support Latino-owned media and Latino journalists. Not because it's just a moral imperative, right? Not because it makes you feel good, but because we won't have a functioning democracy, a functioning community, an empowered community without it. And it's not, and it's also, I tell people all the time, it's an and. It's not or. Right now, the tiny little Latino media infrastructure that we do have, 77%, and by the way, this is very outdated information, because we have not actually studied the Latino media landscape in a way that actually gives us a full picture of what it is, what the state is. The last really known research, and Pew is coming out with some really fantastic stuff lately. I really have to give it up to Pew. They're doing amazing work. It's all very, very recent. But CUNY did a media landscape in 2019 out of New York. And they found that there's an imbalance in the small media landscape that currently exists. So right now, more than half, about 55% to 60 some odd percent, depending on who's surveyed and what research it is, of Latinos are accessing their content digitally. And that is through search, that is through social, and podcasts and other digital means. The vast majority of US-born Latinos prefer their content, their news and information content, in English, like 90%. From non-US born Latinos, about half actually prefer their news and information content in English, right? And yet, when you look at the media landscape, 77% of those in existence are creating their content in Spanish, right? So you have an imbalance of language preference, and then you have an imbalance of accessibility. So the majority of those Latino media entities are still legacy formats, newspapers, radio, right, broadcast, et cetera. So that is not to suggest, though, the takeaway here is not that we need less Spanish language digital news and more English digital news, right? No. The takeaway is that we need to balance and reform, reform's not the right word, change, evolve, there you go, evolve the media landscape in a way that actually is meeting the preferences of the people, right? And also increase both languages, because they are both as important to every single one of those communities right? So this is and. And so that's why, I guess, to answer the question in a very long-winded way, is that for me, specifically working with Latinas, because we are focused on the Latina community, no offense to the men, but you know, Latinas don't have a whole lot, so we need to build that up ourselves. And so ensuring that we have that perspective, that I am, even to the extent if it's just being able to employ just one more journalist or one more content creator, right? If they happen to get a couple extra $100 because they did a submission, then great, right? It's eventually that will scale, but that is how critical and really how high impact. I think it's like almost like an oversized impact because there's so little, that when we collectively work together, that impact is multiplied even further when we're able to get folks back, you know, back to work, back to reporting, back to content creating, and doing so in a way that is actually going to reach people in the preferences in which they want, whether it's language or whether it's format or whether it's any other thing.
Thank you, Lucy, for bringing that up, because I did want to bring you in the conversation, because the Pew Research is where I went to get these numbers, and it says while U.S. Latinos overwhelmingly get their news in English and prefer in English, those born outside have more varied habits. 41% get it mostly in Spanish, 26% get it primarily in English, 31% do both about equally. 47% of Latino immigrants prefer their news in Spanish, while 22% prefer English, and 31% do not express a preference. But to me, when I read it, I was like, so we need both. Yes. We need both all the time, everywhere, and accessible. So Luis, would you please expand on this?
Yeah, totally agree. I think we get way too caught up with language, right? The beauty nowadays is that most kids, it's really fascinating what has happened. When I first started Univision, you basically had two huge cohorts. You had the Spanish onlys, right? And the English onlys. And now it looks more like a bell curve, right? The largest cohort and the largest group of people are bilingual, right? So fortunately, people like my daughter, Daniela, the language doesn't matter. She has that beautiful luxury of not caring, because she could go this way, she can go that way. She can go English, she can go Spanish. And what's going to determine what she watches? The cultural relevancy of the storytelling. The cultural relevancy of what they are being told, how they are being told, how they're being spoken to, right? We're blessed that no longer are we in 1955 San Antonio when you couldn't speak Spanish, right? We're blessed that now even non-Latinos want to speak Spanish, which is why everybody fights to get their kids into the dual language schools, right? So it is totally an and, right? At Univision, this was a big part of our conversation constantly, that we were not beholden to Spanish language because that's all our people understood. No, that was a strategic, purposeful part of what we did. Because we knew that our people could watch ABC, they could read the Washington Post, they could read the New York Times. They chose not to because we were providing something they weren't getting anywhere else. So to tag on to that, and what I've seen now being in the public media space, is I think we need more people like Silvia, right? And like Lucy. We need more people at the Washington Post. We need more people at the New York Times that can tell our stories through the lens of what you grew up with. You grew up here in San Antonio? No?
In Illinois.
In Illinois. Okay. Well, whatever your background was, my background was growing up in LA, right? So I have that lens of being able to tell and being able to project onto the people that I lead and the people and the institutions that I run through a lens of being born to Mexican immigrants and what that meant to me and what it continues to mean to me, right? So I would tell you that it is always going to be an and. There's great work being done in public media, for example. But guess how many people look like us that are leaders in public media? Not too many. I just came from the national meeting of public media leaders, 350 stations around the country. I am telling you, we don't have enough leaders that look like the four of us in those rooms. And that's where it starts to make the difference. It's just like companies, right? Companies need more Latino board representation. It all starts at the top. We need more CEOs. We need more managers. We need more leaders, because it's a trickle-down effect. Because then they're going to be intentional and purposeful about making sure that there's more Silvias in the room, that there's more Luises in the room, right? That there's more Lucys in the room. Because if not, it becomes a camaraderie kind of a, it's inevitable. I've seen it time and time again. New CEO, guess what they do? The first thing they do, they bring in a new leadership team. And guess who that new leadership team? It's all their buddies. It's all their buddies that work with them at the last place. Happens time and time again. So the only way that we fix that is by having more people that look like us in the room leading.
That deserves an applause. Yes, that's true. Thank you, Luis. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our own local PBS station, KLRN, where I also host a TV show called Salud, where we do feature Latina leaders right here in our San Antonio area, so part of the public media. Yay!
Give it up for public media.
So a shout out to them for creating, that's an original piece from KLRN. But so I want to wrap up with another number. So a recent study conducted by the Berkeley Media Studies Group, which was referenced yesterday, revealed that less than 6% of news about racism and racial equity reference Latinos, who constitute nearly 20% of all Americans and over 40% of all people in color. So my last question to all of you is, and you started on this, but what actionable steps can media organizations take to improve the diversity and inclusion of not just staff and leadership, but our stories? And how can journalists and communities hold these organizations accountable? Just a little question.
You're going to hand it to her.
Well, I feel like I would be remiss to not also shout out the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, which is a national organization with chapters across the country, including, actually, San Antonio's is independent, the San Antonio Association of Hispanic Journalists, which are really critical in not only providing a support network, but a pipeline, and also pressuring media companies across the country to kind of bring more Latinos in news. I totally credit NHJ for the reason why I'm at the Washington Post. I met the first person who was a recruiter there from the Washington Post through an NHJ conference. So that's really important to have. And I think in general, it's cliche, but we really do need to start young with young journalists and young students in schools and in colleges, that this can be a viable path and career, which is sometimes very hard to do when this news industry is so volatile. And, we're a community that doesn't have generational wealth that we can then put towards having a crappy job at a local newspaper as you make your way up. So doing more to help support students and fund those students to be able to go do things, I think is definitely a really big first step.
1000% agree. I think it really has to be a holistic approach in order to continue moving this needle. But this is definitely my bias showing, but we have to own our own institutions. It's very clear that they're not interested in letting us in. Time and time and time and time again. He was just at a meeting where there was probably a handful of Latino, not just leadership, but decision makers, right? Not the adjacency, but the people who actually make the decision, who they're going to hire, what journalists they're going to lay off that week, right? And so for me, I think that if we're constantly griping about these numbers, right? Year after year after year after year, there's a report. Latino representation in entertainment media isn't getting better. Some years it's worse. Latino journalists the numbers are stagnating. It's like stagnation after stagnation after stagnation. At what point do we say, okay, we're gonna build our own, right? So that to me is one of the number one ways in which we're actually going to make a significant dent in this problem. One of the things that I'm working on right now is building out a Latino consortium of media owners. They can be nonprofit or for-profit. Luz is a for-profit institution. There's this initiative called Press Forward, and they've recently announced that they are making $500 million available to support local news and news infrastructure in the US. And so what we're saying is, okay, if we're going to invest $500 million, right, it's a lot of money, into institutions where $1 million or several $1 million can make a significant difference in their ability to scale, then Latinos need to be right at the forefront saying, here we are. Right, so that's one of the things that I'm working on aggressively right now with a number of different colleagues in the space. And we're only just putting that together. But the part that you all, that everybody, that the community can be really active in is being those validators for us. Silvia, actually, when they said that you'd won the Pulitzer, what is it? Pulitzer. The Pulitzer, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, but I actually did know that. I did see it, and then I made the connection, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. And the first thing that came to mind is like, I need to do a profile on her. Everybody needs to know the work that she's doing, right? And part of the reason why they won't give us things is because they say that you all don't want it, right? So, I mean, I don't know how many people on social media, but it is very effective. But just sending a message or an email even to these editors and resharing these stories that are out there, or telling your friends and family about it. Hey, did you hear about Silvia? This Silvia person, she's a Latina and she won a Pulitzer. Do you even know what a Pulitzer is? Right? It's like those little conversations that spread. And when we start to see that kind of activity, and that the community at large cares about these stories, they care about these people, they're supporting these media institutions. Like, I don't know how many local, whether it's digital or nonprofit, your local PBS, but how often are you actually engaging with any of these publications, right? That is so, so critical that we have our own community intentionally seeking out those of us who are out here doing the work, because that's what the funders look at, right? That's what the people who control capital and control decisions and are the decision makers, that's what they're looking at. And they love, love, love to point out that when we create something that is Latino owned and created, that you don't want it and that you don't support it. They love it. And so it's not that you don't support it, but if you're not getting access to it and you're not sharing it, then how do you even know it exists? So that's what I would say is the biggest, for me at least, way in which we can make a difference.
Thank you, Lucy. Luis, we want to hear from you.
Two things on that. So again, in the spirit of it's not either or, it's and, right? I think that I worry about the commercial business, the commercial media business model, right? Having spent 25 years at Univision, it is very difficult in this day and age to continue to sustain a newsroom the size and scope that needs to be sustained. So I really, really worry about the deterioration of the local markets. More and more, they're all wanting to become streamers, right? Once you want to become a global streamer, you tend to lose that connectivity, which is what got you there, right? Univision didn't become Univision without San Antonio, without LA, without those local marketplaces. So I worry about that, which is one of the reasons that I actually took this leap of faith to get into the nonprofit media and news world, because I think there's an opening there for us. I think there is a huge opportunity to support your local NPR stations, your local PBS stations. In Texas, we have a very unique property called the Texas Tribune, which has done phenomenally well as a not-for-profit news entity, which is really one of the case studies for the world, which is why Evan Smith, their founder and editor, has now actually gone to go work for another entity where he's helping other towns that don't have news organizations to start their own nonprofit news organizations, even if it's small. So I would say that, yes, in an ideal scenario, we have more Latino-owned media organizations. That is not going to be our reality. So if that is not going to be our reality completely, 100%, then we need more people sitting in the right seats making decisions. And we need to support the people who are being innovators. And I think that right now, the not-for-profit news organizations that are out there that are starting in these little communities by people like you and I, who have an idea to try and tell the stories that the local newspaper cannot tell anymore because it doesn't exist in their communities. I think that's another wonderful way that you and we as communities can celebrate and really elevate the storytelling that needs to happen, that I just fear is not going to continue to happen at the commercial media level.
Can I add one little thing to that? I looked at that Pew Research Center study before our panel, and one of the things that struck me was that they've seen a decline in news consumption among Latinos over recent years. In 2020, it was 31% of Latinos said they followed the news closely, and by 2023, it was 22%. And that was, Latinos followed it less closely overall than Black and white Americans. And so I do think this speaks to what you both have been saying about the community can also help by going to our media companies and sharing the Latino stories who are working at your local and national papers, because unfortunately, a lot of it comes down to the numbers, and when they're looking at the numbers of the stories that come out, that dictates whether you get to continue telling those types of stories or not.
100%. I think it's for profit and for nonprofit, right? Because nonprofit still gets sponsors, funders, right? So I know, like for Salud, I am sharing every time it's on air because I want them to see that people want this and they enjoy it, so they'll continue to do that. I know we're out of time, Dr. Gold, but I'm going to say one last thing before we wrap up. And just that I brought my son here yesterday. He's 14 years old, and he was taking notes. And then afterwards, I was like, hey, so did you feel like inspired to help now, right? Because like now that you've heard all of this. And he said, he's always teaching me, right? He said, well, I don't really feel like this is where I need to get involved personally, but I want to support the people who are doing the work. So he's like, Mom, I do want to continue supporting MACRI. And that's what I hear here. Right? Like, so to echo, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, as a member of the local San Antonio Association of Hispanic Journalists, you're right, they are doing a lot of work. So if this isn't like something that you feel passionate to pick up the baton and do, support those who are doing the work, like those organizations and MACRI, of course. And one last thing, Texas Tribune, their night editor, is a Latina from San Antonio, Laura Garcia, who's a vice president of the San Antonio Association of Hispanic Journalists. So thank you, panelists. A round of applause for Luis, Lucy, and Silvia. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Wolf.